Welcome to the programme. It's been almost 10 months since Russian soldiers invaded Ukraine, but despite hundreds of thousands of reservists being called up, Russia is no longer advancing in any meaningful way on the battlefield. President Putin insists that Russian soldiers are on the ground, as he describes it, fighting brilliantly, and he calls them heroes. But there are some who refuse to fight. We've heard testimony from servicemen, relatives and activists which suggests that some of them have been subjected to mistreatment, threats and even violence to try to force them back to the front line. Our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg has been listening to some of their stories.
The official view from the Kremlin is that Russians believe their war in Ukraine is a noble cause, one they're ready to die for. But after 10 months of fighting, not all the soldiers think that. Sergei has agreed to tell me about his son, Stas, an army officer. We've changed their names to protect their identities. Deployed to Ukraine, his son refused to fight.
He told me it was a difficult decision for him to take. I told him better to take it. This is not our war. It's not a war of liberation. I'll put that in writing that I refused to fight, he said. He and several others who refused had their guns taken off them and were put under armed guard.
Sergei travelled to the front line in Ukraine to try to secure his son's release. Eventually, Stas was sent back to Russia and revealed the full drama of his detention, how Russian soldiers had tried to force him to fight.
They beat him, and then they took him outside as if they were going to shoot him. They made him lie on the ground and told him to count to 10. He refused, so they beat him over the head several times with a pistol. He told me his face was covered in blood, and then they took him into a room and told him, "You're coming with us, otherwise we'll kill you." But someone there said, "I'll take him to work in the storeroom."
And there are other stories. These mobilised Russian troops were locked in a cellar after they said they won't go back into battle. Basements turned into dungeons for those who don't want to fight.
Refuses to fight.
Human rights activists say cases like these reflect the pressure Russian soldiers are coming under in Ukraine from their own commanders.
Это просто метод заставить людей опять вернуться на эту бойню.
It's a way of making people go back into that bloodbath. But it's not possible to force people to fight in a war. The commanders know only violence and intimidation. They're used to it.
Why are some Russian soldiers in Ukraine refusing to go back to the front? In some cases, it is a moral decision. But for many others, having experienced the horrors of the battlefield, it's simply an attempt to stay alive. Later, I speak to the mother of a Russian lieutenant. She says he'd contacted her from Ukraine to tell her he'd been put in a basement after disobeying orders to advance. He was with 4 other officers. They haven't been seen for 5 months.
I was later told that the building they were in was shelled and that all 5 men were missing. They said no remains were found. It doesn't make sense. It's absurd. The way my son was treated wasn't only illegal, it was inhuman.
Russia has inflicted enormous suffering on its neighbour. It's threatening its own people, too.
My son told me, "I never thought my own country would treat me this way. People here don't understand how much danger we're in. Not from the opposing side, but from our side."
For this war, the Kremlin is demanding total support.
And Steve joins us live now from Moscow. And Steve, I'm just reading your online piece where you give more details of what the families, the parents of these soldiers are saying. You said that one father said that Russian soldiers had been given no cover. There was no intelligence gathering, no preparation. They'd been ordered to advance, but no one knew what lay ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said in the report, for some, refusing to fight may be a moral decision, but for many others, there are different reasons. And in the two cases we talked about it in the report, yes, in the first case, the army officer was shocked by not receiving any cover, any lack of intelligence gathering before being sent into battle. In the second case, the army lieutenant had told his mother that he'd refused to fight because leading his men would be leading them to a certain death, advancing further on the battlefield. So I think the conditions on the ground, the realities on the ground, are causing these soldiers to refuse to fight.
And Steve, is there any kind of support being offered to them when they do return?
Well, not that we know of at the moment. I should say it's very difficult to collect this kind of testimony, to find out what happened to people and what's happening to them now. I mean, the BBC Moscow producer Will Vernon spent weeks messaging some of the relatives, servicemen, in some cases months, to hear their stories. And many were too frightened, understandably, to speak. Others decided that they wanted to get their stories across. But what you get, you gradually piece together this picture, which contradicts the official picture that you see in the Russian state media. Because if you watch Russian state television, the picture there is that Russian soldiers are happy to do their duty, to defend the motherland. These kind of stories are not covered in the Russian state media.
And so what are they saying about this particular report? Has there been any reaction? Because we have heard and we have seen videos, unverified videos on social media of Russian soldiers who are refusing to fight or pulling back, or, from the very beginning of the conflict. But these are actual testimonies now that you have. Are they just dismissing this as some kind of disinformation?
Well, generally, the reaction of the authorities here is that talk of disillusionment amongst soldiers, talk of soldiers being detained, is simply disinformation. I mean, just a few days ago, the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, suggested that claims of camps or incarceration centres for soldiers was utter nonsense, he said. It was fake claims, and the authorities just dismiss it. Because, as I say, the official picture of events is that everything is going according to plan and that there are no major problems amongst the soldiers on the battlefield.
Steve, thanks so much for your reporting there. And Steve's piece, the longer piece, can be found on our website at the usual place. Let's get the latest from Ukraine now, where forces in the east of the country say they've struck the headquarters of Russia's Wagner mercenary group. Russian state media agency TASS says the hotel hit had not been operating. The news comes as Ukrainian security officials have sanctioned 7 senior clerics belonging to a branch of the Orthodox Church controlled by Moscow. President Zelensky said everything was being done to make sure Moscow could not harm Ukrainian society. Well, let's go straight to our Hugo Bachega, who joins us from Kiev. And Hugo, let's first talk about this Wagner mercenary group. We know they've been operating in Ukraine, all over Ukraine, from the very beginning of this conflict, and we hear that one of their headquarters has been struck.
Yeah, so Yelda, we had 2 major strikes by the Ukrainian military over the weekend. First in Luhansk, where the governor there, the Ukrainian governor, said a hotel that was being used as a major base for mercenaries was targeted. He talked about major losses there. We haven't been able to independently confirm this information, but we do know that members of the Wagner group have been operating in the east of the country. And obviously they've been accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity. They've been in some other conflict zones such as Syria, Mali, and the Central African Republic. So this is what happened in Luhansk in the east. There was a second strike in the south of the country, in the city of Melitopol. And again, the speculation was that another base, another facility that was being used by this group was targeted. We heard from the exiled mayor of Melitopol, who said he couldn't confirm this information, but he said it was a possibility possibility. And again, he talked about dozens of people who were killed. We've seen video of the site after that attack. So two major strikes potentially targeting this group that has been operating here in Ukraine.
Yeah, we were just showing our viewers some of those images that you were just talking about. Tell us also about this other piece of news that's come out about 7 senior clerics belonging to a branch of the Orthodox Church viewed as sympathetic to Moscow being sanctioned.
Yeah, so this is the latest development in this investigation by the security services here targeting the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Now, this is a church that cut off its ties with the Russian Orthodox Church after the start of the war. The Russian Orthodox Church has been supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, the accusation here is that some key members of the church have been carrying out what the authorities have described anti-Ukrainian activities. So in the last few weeks, we've seen some raids in churches and monasteries. So now the authorities said 7 senior clerics have been targeted. Their assets have been seized. There's a travel ban that's been imposed. And interestingly, President Zelensky last night said that everything was being done to make sure Moscow could not harm Ukrainian society. So these investigations continue. The accusation here is that top members of this church are carrying out what the authorities have been describing as pro-Russia activities.
Hugo, thank you so much for that update there.